Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join Building Public's Humanities Combating Isolation for one more week. I hope everyone continues to be well. My name is Maria González Pendas. Many of you know me, but we always have some new guests, so some repetition is in order. I'm the coordinator of the Public Humanities Initiative at the SOF Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia, and I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to this series, part of our ongoing commitment to promote expanded and experimental modes of humanistic work that is public-facing and civically engaged. And here in particular in this seminar, part also of our continuing efforts to do so in our new virtual reality, and believe as the challenges are many. And I want to thank particularly Kes, Tez, and Lindsay, and everyone at the SOF Heyman Center for keeping the lights on and keeping us informed and connected, which is not always easy this time of age. So as you all know, this seminar features the work of graduate students that we have been promoting through fellowships and mentoring for the past year, also in collaboration with Humanities New York. As an interdisciplinary group of emerging scholars, the fellows will feature, that are featured in this series have worked both together and independently to implement projects that bridge humanistic thinking with social work, scholarly research with community building. In the process, they have also thought quite hard and oftentimes quite creatively about the methods and the media by which to develop and communicate such thinking, explore it with genres other than the research paper and even the traditional curatorial setting through media such as podcasting, mapping, and even letter writing. In their presentations of their projects and of this media, our fellows will discuss how their concerns emerge both from within the confines of their disciplines, but also in a commitment to break out of academic silos. They will lay out their current thinking about the field of public humanities and how the work speaks to and can critically contribute, we think, to what some are calling the tectonic changes that the current closure of the public sphere is provoking in higher education. You all have been thinking critically for some time what many are now only asking, people are asking now in the times of COVID, namely on how to teach, how to do research, and more importantly, with whom and where. And by where here, we mean explicitly outside of the confines of the university. The presentations will be followed by responses or presentations by guests and conclude with an open discussion for questions, feedbacks, and ideas for the future life of these fascinating projects. This event is very helpful for all of the presenters and for myself, but also for the incoming cohort of fellows, many of whom are coming to our seminars and are currently thinking and rethinking their projects on which we will work together. So thank you all for being here. In our seminar today, we move sidewise in the world of digital scholarship. In the past two meetings, we discussed podcasting, and today we move on to mapping and graphic information systems, GIS, to discuss how visual digital media, the production and archiving of images, and cartographic practices can intersect to tell new histories and reach new audiences, particularly when it comes to the urgencies of environmental justice and environmental humanities. Our fellow presenter is Scot McFarlane, a PhD candidate in history, whose research looks at the rivers as repositories and producers of historical forces in North America from the middle of the 19th century to the emergence of the environmental movement in the 20th century. This public project, of which we will hear about today, is closely related, but also very different from his research and his teaching here at Columbia, and has brought together mapping, walking, non-academic teaching, and collaboration with environmental activists. Following from Scot, we will hear from Wright Kennedy. Thank you so much for joining us today and through the series. I am very glad to put you two in conversation today, Wright and Scot. Wright is a postdoctoral research scholar at the History Department and the Center for Spatial Research here at Columbia, having received his PhD in history from Rice in 2018. He has investigated a wide range of urban history topics with GIS, including hurricane recovery, residential segregation, and environmental injustices, and also, I believe, epidemics. And perhaps, Wright, we should also talk, not today, but someday, about featuring your work in the Care for the Polis series, which here I want to remind everyone of it, a series happening on Thursdays at the SF Heyman Center, and we will be sending the link on the chat box in a minute for it. And speaking of the chat box, let me summarize how these events work. We're in a Zoom meeting. Everyone is behaving already very, very well. You all have your cameras and your microphones off, which we hope that they remain as such during the presentations, which will last about 15 minutes each. After that, I hope that you all turn on your cameras and that we can construe some sense of community for the conversations. During the presentations, you can send questions and ideas and comments through the chat box. In the Q&A, we can revisit those questions, but I also encouraged you to digitally raise your hands and I can call on you to ask your questions. If you open the participants link on the Zoom toolbox, then you can see the option to digitally raise your hand. As we've said before, the whole point of this series is to generate feedback and new ideas together, so please do so. And with that, I'm going to pass on the control of the screen to Scott. Thank you, everyone, for being here. All yours, Scott.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my project that you can see here, Confluence, the history of North American rivers. And this project started out as a way to sort of what's a way that we can sort of rebuild the environmental movement around history? And there is actually a long history of using river history to get people excited about protecting their environment. And maybe the most famous case is actually on the Hudson, where there was Con Edison wanted to destroy Storm King Mountain, and they were able to use the historical importance of the Hudson River to gain standing in the courts. And this allowed them to ultimately defeat this project. And so there's this earlier history of using river history to support the environment and the communities that live along it. But it's something that has largely disappeared. There's no longer best-selling river history books like there were in the middle of the 20th century. And so this project was one way of trying to address that. And so here you can see our homepage. Nice, pretty map, colors, and then the feature is rivers. But I've also sort of tried to use this project as a way to sort of frame the rest of the work that I do as a historian. So I have my syllabus here from the seminar that I taught last fall, Rivers, Politics, and Power in the U.S. And then I've also done some things related to COVID, as far as thinking about how to engage people when we're apart. And one of the interesting things about this project is that it has sort of come full circle, and that originally when I sort of joined this public humanities program, I was like, this is a website. People can come from all over North America and they can read about their rivers and get excited about other rivers, and everyone's just going to be online checking out this information and getting excited. But then I realized, and Maria, along with my fellows, sort of directed me, well, that's not really enough, and that doesn't really work well. And Wright and I have actually talked about this too, how, when everything you're doing is digital, you're just kind of banging your head against the wall half the time trying to figure out how to make the map work or something like that. So then, this idea of, well, how do you sort of use this site as a platform, as sort of a center, but not as the only place. And so one of those ideas, which was supposed to happen this past April, which was to create a series of walks that were going to take place along different rivers, starting with the Harlem River. And so this is a poster from the Harlem River. We were going to walk along the river and sort of partially also experience the ways in which, by physically walking along the river, you realize actually how hard it is to access the Harlem River, and how most of the time you're not on the river at all. But now this sort of walk, which had to be postponed, is going to take place in a digital format with people actually sort of recording parts of the river themselves, and then we'll have a conference not unlike this one. The other thing, and this was my fellow fellows came up with, which was to create these river videos. So this is the first river video here that I created along with my son Walter, and basically, this is something that I really have enjoyed being stuck inside, is just seeing videos and photographs of the outside. And so this is me narrating the history of a river, in this case, the Concord River. And so that's sort of one of the ways in which this project has evolved. And then, the sort of core part of the project is still these actual river histories. So for example, here is the Harlem River here. And it's, and each river's history is created using the same sort of platform where you sort of move across space. And I've used a mixture of, say, photographs that I've taken, such as this picture of this tulip tree in Inwood Hill Park, and then historic photographs along with sort of what were supposed to be brief descriptions of the project. And this is a map that I collaborated on with a student in GSAP, and you can see here sort of the outline of the present day river in red, overlaid with what the river would have looked like 100 years or 200 years before that. So we're able to use these maps to show change over time. And then finally, just thinking more broadly about rivers. And so some of the other things that I'm working on short term, I just created a workshop. I was supposed to go to a conference taking place essentially right now called River Rally, which is a conference that's specifically designed for river conservationists, for people who work in river conservation. It's not an academic conference. And I was going to present alongside a colleague in Michigan State on the power of hidden river histories. And so we ended up recording a digital workshop where we frame some of this work and really feature this project. And it's interesting because this was a pre-recorded workshop, but I've slowly been hearing from people who are interested in following up and figuring out, well, so how do I get my river on your site? How do I create a strong river history? And that's something I'm still trying to figure out right now. My main goal would be to ultimately be able to teach the course that I taught as a seminar last fall, would be to teach that to river conservationists across the country. And once again, this is something that, well, it would have been an online course and maybe not very exciting because it's online, but because we're all stuck online anyways, this fall is going to be a great opportunity to teach that course. But I'm still in the process of sort of seeking out funding for it. I think I will probably need to provide a stipend for the people to attend. So paying my quote students to be there, and we'll use this class as a way to think about what river history means and how river history can be useful, while also working on their individual rivers as separate projects. And I guess the other big thing I would say about being in this program and working on this project with everyone, and especially with Maria, is really thinking about what are the ways in which this is not just a standalone project or a public project, but it is an academic project. And so one of the questions that I have thinking about, being outside of academia a year from now, is what rigorous pieces of that sort of style of thinking and that methodology do I want to bring with me if I'm able to really turn this into a career and actually keep working with different conservation groups. am I going to, obviously these are sort of, can be false binaries, but am I going to be a conservationist and activist, or an academic, or both? And what are, at least what are the good bits that I want to bring along with me that will be useful? And thinking about another reason to make this project, and the first digital humanities project that I created, which was about a racist massacre that took place in Texas, and was very much my goal for doing that, and sort of this as well, was bringing also like a level of authority of bringing the Columbia brand name that people get weirdly excited about. And so, the other thing I want to think about is, if this project isn't sort of a Columbia project anymore, but it's my project, or is part of a river conservation networks project, what kind of authority will they have that will get people interested in this kind of history? And I guess one thing to think about too is how do you engage people with river history? And many people who think of themselves as history buffs, as people who love history for various reasons and are perhaps willing to listen to a historian, those are, that's one group of people that I'm really interested in bringing into river history, so that they actually care and understand about the rivers that are near them and can advocate for them just the way that they would advocate for some historic monument or some more static piece of history that's in their hometown. And so I really want to find a way to make this site, this project, everything sort of appealing to them, and not have them sort of perhaps shut down or otherwise think, well, this is simply environmentalism or something like that. So yeah, I think I will leave it at that and hand it over to Wright.
That's my cue. Thank you, Scott. And I want to thank Maria and the other organizers for having me here. Oh, Scott, I think you have to unshare for me to be able to share. Yeah, thanks. So today, I just want to give a brief overview of spatial history through some of the projects that I've worked on, some of my academic research, and also talk about ways that these projects can be made accessible, and this type of academic work can be made accessible to the general public, and to get, like Scott was saying, to get the public interested in this really innovative work that's being done at universities, but doesn't often see the light of day, or there are these websites that are built that end up with 100 visitors a year rather than 100,000 visitors a year, when it's that level of work being done to put together these sites. So just as a brief overview, sometimes spatial history and historical GIS are used interchangeably, but GIS is geographic information systems, and all of you have probably used a geographic information system in some form or another. Google Maps is a basic GIS. And so if we go to Google Maps and search for an address, what we get is location on the map. So in the background, there's a spreadsheet that stores all the addresses in the city linked up with that location on the map. And so it's a way of connecting this tabular data and other types of sources with that spatial location. So then we can reintegrate space as one of the dimensions in understanding these events. So we also have other information connected. So you might imagine each of these lines in the Google card or whatever it's called being a field in a spreadsheet. And so this is the exact same way that historical GISs work. It's just historical information is being included in those fields and historical locations. So first, I want to talk about, this is my dissertation work, my book project that's ongoing right now, but ways that we can use GIS and use these kind of new media, new perspective on the past to understand something that's received considerable attention from historians, and that probably needs much more attention publicly. And so that's segregation and the rise of Jim Crow in the South and in cities across the United States. And connecting that with understandings of health and the transformations of health at the end of the 19th century. So if we look at sources that I brought together for this study, it kind of gives an understanding of the way these GISs work as well. And so you can kind of think of it as a layer cake or, an onion that has different layers that we can put into conversation with each other, or different sources that can be put into conversation. So for instance, for my New Orleans study, I brought together property tax values. The left side shows a property tax record, assessment record from New Orleans. And these have spatial locations. We're able to connect these with the blocks in the city and to look at the change in values across the time. Also used historical elevation data. So this understanding how places were historically, rather than just taking our modern topography and modern elevation data and applying it to the past. Because as I'm sure Scot's found with a lot of his work, the course of these rivers have changed. Elevations, especially in New Orleans, have changed since massive draining projects in the early 20th century. We also have fire insurance maps that we can bring in. And so this is one block of a fire insurance map. Let's see if the laser pointer works. And so this is the one block. And within these blocks, these are really highly detailed maps, and these show building footprints within the city. So this is an 1886 map, I believe, showing all the building footprints in the city. So there's a lot of opportunity for creating even 3D representations that are pretty accurate of the city to create these more immersive environments to understand these different processes. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the 3D modeling at the end of this section. And we can also get streets and historical addresses from that. And then one of the key pieces from my study was using death certificates, so understanding where people were dying and what they were dying from in the city. And so this is just kind of a standard death certificate from New Orleans. It lists the name, the race or skin color, nativity, age, and cause of death. But importantly, it lists where the person lives. So this person lived on Bienville, between Tonty and Bienville Street. And so we're able to match those locations, those spatial locations, to places in the historical map. We can also take city directories. These are like phone books from the 19th century, and it lists about 25% of the people in the city. But it lists where they lived, and also oftentimes where they worked. So we can look at mobility within the city, so where people, likely traveled from their home to work every day. And so this is useful not just for kind of understanding the flows of the city, but also for disease modeling and understanding how diseases move throughout the city. And so one of the key parts of my study was looking at this divergence between Black and white average ages of death. During this time where you have many advances in public health, you have the rise of bacteriology and understanding that bacteria spreads some diseases, the viruses spread others. And you have clean water movements, sanitarian movements to really clean up the city during this time period. But what we see is that white average age of death increases, what we'd expect. So people are dying on average at older ages, whereas Black average age of death doesn't really increase, and it actually decreases a few years during this time of advancement of public health. And so my big argument is that segregation was a driving factor in this, but segregation connected with these environmental burdens and these disease burdens unique to different environments. So if we look at New Orleans, what we see, it's a little counterintuitive. The Mississippi River is here, and we have the highest ground in the city along the Mississippi River in this area. And that's from the natural levee forming, so the overflow of the river and sediment buildup over years. And so when people talk about the bowl of New Orleans, this is this low-lying area in the middle, and this is the area that's well below sea level now. was still a few feet below sea level in the 19th century and had, you know, cypress swamps and everything else going on. And so if we look at mortality in New Orleans and the mortality rate of these blocks in particular, we can see from 1880 to 1915, there are these clear trends in the spatial location of mortality. And so what I've done is broken these into different elevation groups. So we have the highlands, which run along the river, and this was valuable in industrial land and port facilities. So you had working class, lower income people living along the river by these nuisance industries. But as you get off the river, in this Midlands area, if any of you have been to New Orleans, this is the St. Charles Avenue. So this is the really wealthy area because it's farther enough away from the nuisance industries of the river, but it's still above the flood areas of the lowlands and bottomlands. And so if we look, this whole area, and I know red on red didn't show up very well, this is really low income and increasingly African-American neighborhoods at the turn of the 20th century. And we see these patterns persist demographically for these neighborhoods through the present. And so we see the areas that flooded during Hurricane Katrina as the same areas that had these really high mortality rates during this time period. And so these blocks have, you know, over 350 deaths per 10,000 people that lived on in those blocks. And so in part also you have this artificial crowding because people don't want to live in this swampland. And so you have this artificial crowding in this area. And when you have the rise of these neighborhood covenants and racially exclusive blocks, African Americans living in the city have fewer and fewer places to choose from when living. And these places they can choose from are much lower in elevation. And so if we look at things like tuberculosis mortality, and this shows the intensity of tuberculosis for the white population in red, the red circles, and then the black population with the blue contours. We can see this shift also. And so we see overlap in these areas between black and white tuberculosis. And we'd expect to find tuberculosis deaths in similar environments, you know, similar areas of high crowding and everything else. But as we get up to 1910, 1915, we see the white tuberculosis mortality declines significantly, and you don't have these hot spots of tuberculosis mortality, whereas the black tuberculosis mortality is occurring in neighborhoods that are almost exclusively black, predominantly black, because of the rise of residential segregation. So we're seeing the story of residential segregation play out, while at the same time seeing the equally inequalities from these divergent health outcomes, divergent disease environments. And so what we get, again, this is just another way of looking at the graph we looked at the beginning, but white adults on average die 7 years older, whereas black adults die 3 years younger during this time period. So, you know, black adults didn't undergo the same mortality transition that white adults did because of residential segregation. And so it's these underlying factors in addition to economic, education, you know, all these different social factors. Other things we can do with this data set. So this is showing a few epidemics in New Orleans at the beginning of the 20th century. And we see in blue are the deaths from influenza in 1915, so right before the big pandemic of 1917, 1918. And also we see red deaths, which are smallpox deaths. And so we see those occurring in these same segregated African-American areas in this lower lying area. Whereas yellow fever, which tended to be thought of as a stranger's disease because people that lived in yellow fever environments could acquire immunity or some level of immunity as infants. So we see yellow fever deaths happening in the French Quarter. So this is the main French Quarter, and large immigrant neighborhood. A lot of Sicilians and Italians lived in this neighborhood at the beginning of the 19th century. And so understanding these differences in environment and then the people living in these environments is one of the key things to understand, you know, even the current epidemic, and understanding who's considered an essential employee, and being exposed to many more pathways of infection and higher risk. So with those fire insurance maps, going back now to talk about these 3D environments, we can create these 3D mock-ups and build these, video games can have been able to put a lot more money into it, but build these historical representations that can be used for, pedagogical purposes, for teaching, but also for research, and engaging the public. And this is increasingly a format that the public and the younger generations are, already at home with. And so being able to communicate our research in the ways that the public already is taking in information is, I think, a key part of building engagement and bridging the academic public divide. Go through the second one quickly, but this is a study on the transatlantic slave trade and looking at the decline in British slave mortality over the end of the 18th century. And this again is just it's a pretty important finding for understanding the Middle Passage, but it's also an important lesson in thinking about the environment and the role the environment plays, not environmental determinism, but in influencing how people experience their day-to-day lives at the macro scale. And so this data set that I used for this project was ship logs from a climatological study. And so they wanted to map out all these ship log books and where they took temperature readings and everything else from about 1650 to 1850 to bring that into the conversation of climate change and understanding sea temperature change. But the other thing we get with this data set, and so these are ship routes from that same data set, are the slave trade voyages. And there's also a great project at Emory on the transatlantic slave trade database where they're trying to document every slave voyage and build out more of that history and the traumatic experiences that happen. But here we see the British slave trade ships, and this is just a sample that made the Middle Passage in red and the Dutch ships in blue. And we can see these are two Dutch ships, and with the Dutch data we had mortality, so the number of enslaved people that died each day at that location. And so we can see these two routes are pretty similar, but the route in blue had a 30% mortality rate for enslaved people. So 30%, so 84 of the enslaved people on board died, whereas the route in green, just 4 slaves died. And it's not just 4 slaves, 4 slaves, enslaved people died, but there's a 1.5%. And these routes are, very similar. And if we overlay climatological data, so looking at ocean currents, we can see that even though they're very close in space, they're very different in the environments they were experiencing. So the blue route was in the doldrum area. Let's see. Whereas the green route followed this central south equatorial current. And so this made all the difference if we look at the macro patterns. So these show the mortality hotspots, so where there was spatial clustering of high mortality in the Dutch route to the Middle Passage. And so the red are the intense spatial clustering, a hotspot, and the blue are the low spatial clustering. And if we look at ship speed as well, we can see the red are the lower ship speeds and the green are the higher ship speeds. And so when slave ships reached the doldrums, or if they got out of that current, they had a much higher mortality rate. And so we can see overlaying this hot spot with the cold spot, we can see that as ships reached these doldrum areas, and so this red and blue dash lines show the general area of the doldrums in July and December. And so the Dutch routes didn't change much over this time, whereas the British routes did change. So we see the lightest colors being the earliest slave ship routes and the darkest colors being the later slave ship routes. And so we see this progression of British routes towards the currents. And so that matches up with this decline in enslaved people mortality in the British routes during this time period. So now I'll go briefly through the Mapping Historical New York project, which is an ongoing project at Columbia, which is much more public facing. And in part, I'm trying to think of how to move those other two projects, New Orleans, residential segregation and mortality, and the slave ship routes, into this public facing format. Whereas this project, the Mapping Historical New York project, is one of these kind of born digital. You know, we're building this project specifically to create this public facing web map. And so what we're doing here is we're taking all of the census records from 1850, 1880, and 1910. So it's a couple million people that were recorded in the census, and trying to put these publicly accessible records into a format that engages the public and that brings meaning to this large amount of information that doesn't really have a story on top of it yet. And so, for instance, and I'll get through this quickly, but we can look at one family, Bernard Haddap and Catherine, John, and Victoria, and we can locate them on the map. And so this is in Brooklyn, Boerum Hill, and so we can see where he lives. So this is the project mapping out each person to their general household address for the different years. And we can look at where the other buttonhole makers, he was a buttonhole maker, where, the textile industry, where these other people live. So he lived in kind of a cluster, a neighborhood of buttonhole makers. And we can look at all the other occupations of Bernard's neighbors. We're going to look at where those people were born. These are all the people born outside of the United States. And these are all the people born in New York. So you have a lot of people living in the same building, and so they're kind of stacked on top of each other. And so we can zoom out and look at all. This is about 3.6 million points visualized on the map, or sorry, 1.8 million points visualized and people visualized for the 1880 census. And we can go over to Manhattan and again, look at the buttonhole makers and look at clusters of buttonhole makers. And here we have buttonhole makers from Poland rather than Germany, or wherever Bernard was from. And so the final goal of this is creating this interactive web map that allows people to come in and query things like, where did the buttonhole makers live, or where did the laborers live, or the Irish laborers in the Lower East Side, or the Jewish Eastern European immigrants in the before 1910. And so we can look at all these, give people the freedom to explore all these demographics and different characteristics of the city, while also building these spatial narratives on top of that kind of open interface. So the web map is this open kind of exploratory, go where you want. And then on top of that, we'll build these stories and narratives that put it into this digestible form for the public. And so we can look at, Seneca Village in Central Park, and the African-American residents that were displaced for the creation of Central Park. We can look at the paper streets in Brooklyn, so the streets that were planned in Brooklyn and were never built, or built significantly different. And there's just we have 1.8 million people in 1880, and there are 1.8 million stories, but we're trying to prioritize the stories that really connect the public and engage the public with this history and understanding how immigrants created the city and continually reshape these neighborhoods and continue to do so to this day. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wright. Thank you, Scott. It was so great to have these two together. I'm going to start asking people to raise their hand. They have a couple of questions. I'm just going to throw a couple of comments there as people start formulating their questions. It's fascinating for me to see, of course, the use of spatial and GIS technologies to organize and interpret historical material very differently and be able to communicate it to different publics. However, it seems to me that the two of you are working or are mobilizing, publics very differently at different stages of your project. And I'm particularly interested by the fact that, Scott, your project is not only looking to become, to make historical information legible to wider publics, but it's also looking to mobilize publics for the production of information. There's a much more reciprocal relationship with publics, at least in the way that you seem to be conceiving the walks and the workshops. And we can talk a little bit more about why the walk and why the workshops, which seems to be spaces where you want to produce information together with your publics in conversations and in walking, and how then you're going to process that back into your web page. Whereas for Wright, you're using this historical material very creatively and making this interactive map, but in a way that the public, it's sort of consuming that information and less so producing. And I think that has to do with the historical nature of the material that you're working with, and perhaps you're thinking of different ways of doing that currently with issues of health and with the COVID-19, and we can talk forever about that. But let's see, there's no digital hands, but I'm gonna ask Milan to ask his question.
Okay, thank you for both of your presentations. Yeah, so actually disconnected, so I'll try and paraphrase the question, can't read it back. But basically, like, I'm surprised by all the data visualization and mapping, but as someone who has never done that, I just look at it and think how much time it would take me, and also just thinking about like our own projects, like our own management of time and energy as a resource as people interested in doing these public humanities projects. That seems like a real challenge, and I think that's something that this fellowship this year has really helped us be very much more mindful of. So I'm wondering for both of you, like what are your challenges and your breakthroughs on own energy as a finite resource?
Thanks, Milan. Yeah, I guess we have sort of, very different projects, because in part, I've spent some of my fellowship money getting other people to make the pretty maps, and thought a lot more about how to scale up this project in a sustainable way, as far as like those story maps that sort of ground these histories are, anyone can do that. And it ended up taking me a lot more time than I anticipated. If I had just done my river for my dissertation, it would have been easy. But it turns out I didn't know that much about the Harlem River. And so that ended up being a lot of work, but it was also a useful experience for me doing that history from scratch, thinking about how someone else would approach that, because ideally in the future I won't be really making these river histories myself. I'll just be the mentor, the cheerleader in the background. So.
That's a great point, Scott. And I think a lot of it is not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so, if you need someone to make a website, you're not gonna have time to learn it, or it's not the best use of your time. You're the expert and the historian of humanities. And so, finding people that are able to really help out with that. I had on my New Orleans project, I had about 12 undergrads working on it, because we did a big data entry and all kinds of stuff. And that was all funded through, pretty small grants that I was able to string together. And the work study program is really an exceptional thing also, I think, in that it can help bring undergrads and grads onto these research projects. And so I think, I'm not sure what it is at Columbia, but at Rice, I paid 25% of the salary, and the federal government paid 75%. And so I could even use, some of my Rice stipend, and, I Airbnb'd my apartment, or a room in my apartment, to raise some money too, but to hire students and engage students. And I think they learned a lot out of it too. And so I really see undergraduate research collaboration with graduate students as a win-win. And, undergrads can make all the websites, they can do all the coding, we've had 30-something students work on the New York project so far.
I think that, something that has run through our conversations, it's sort of the importance of making connections for collective projects in order to tap, and this is a discussion that we had with Scott, since sort of your career development and your project, you wanted to use images and maps, but you really were dedicated to engaging with activist organizations. So your time was better put in developing those connections than on developing, you know, the technology and not skills with the software that were required to it. So identifying kind of that form of career development that each of you want to nurture early in the process, I think, while also understanding the connections and the collectivity of these projects. I think it's very crucial, not to the development of these projects. I will say, right, and I'm sure you know a lot about this. It is fascinating to see how mapping and visual, spatial histories, as you call it, have become so normative in the media and the press right now, you know, in ways that were not so much a couple of years ago. No, the New York Times has this task force on digital mapping, and you see it every time that you see any map, you see the number of names that goes into this project. You know, like these maps have been made and you see like 20 names, which speak of the time economy of producing information through these skills, you know. But I think it is definitely an emerging and a very potent new form of communicating, both sort of in journalism, but also historically. Okay, still not digital hands, but I know Amanda Harding, who's one of our incoming fellows. Welcome, Amanda. You have a question as well.
Yes, hi, thank you. And it's good to see you both, Scott and Wright.
Amanda.
My questions are pretty straightforward, I think, and they're similar but slightly different. And Maria sort of already touched on them, but for Scott, I was curious to hear you talk about how you sort of, when you're creating your river history site and the sort of research and scholarship and framing of it, thinking about whether this was a project you wanted to make legible to academics or certain types of like activists and conservationists. Did you end up sort of just picking one audience and going with that, or do you try to cater to both? I'd just love to hear you talk about how you sort of negotiate that. And then somewhat similarly for Wright, I'm just curious to see what kind of different audiences this more like visual production has opened you up to. What have been some of the benefits and challenges, I guess similarly of trying to share it with academics versus other audiences, and how you've navigated that. I hope those make sense.
Yeah, so I think your question goes a lot off just thinking about authority and competence. And so my audience is definitely not academics, but it's more, and also I guess thinking about how these projects are tied up sort of with you as an individual. I've been trying to collect a lot of academic merit badges that I can use sort of to support this project. You know, and sometimes it's backfired. Like I tried to publish an article in the Journal of American History about rivers and the history of slavery, and it's gonna really be one of those things. And they said, you know, this is too ambitious, you know, go away. But it was, part of my problem was that I was also sort of doing it to sort of, you know, as a sort of backstop to this project, and sort of finding ways to sort of, you know, have all these sort of check marks there. But really, you know, my audience is conservationists, and is getting them to sort of have the confidence to tell these histories, and tell these histories in a way that they will engage with their community members, and also in particular with, you know, it's not a particularly well-formed idea, but just, you know, people who are passionate about history of all kinds, who are not academics, but who don't see the environment and rivers as a place to study that history. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, for the audiences and visual production, you know, starting with the idea of who you want this to speak to is important. But once you get these data sets, you know, it can be much easier to speak to a lot of different audiences and to put it in a format that talks to different audiences. So with the New Orleans project, for instance, eventually plan to have a research site that, you know, academics and can be for pedagogical purposes as well. But I've talked about creating like an app or something that, you know, finding a way to create an app that doesn't sensationalize these deaths or make spectacles, but something, you know, New Orleans has this kind of culture of morbidity, of fatalism, and so having like a Ghost of New Orleans, where you kind of slip in these other messages like, oh, look at the difference that residential segregation made, but people walking around the French Quarter can have the app out, and you know, that's not kind of foregrounded. And so I think that's one of the ways that we can possibly change minds, you know, and engage a public that maybe doesn't want to be engaged. Another project I worked on is imaginerio.org, looking at the history of Rio de Janeiro. And just, this is another challenge in format. We had the Rio mayor tweeted out a link to the map, and we looked at the bounce rate, and everyone would get on the map and then just leave because they were all getting on via mobile, and we hadn't optimized it for a mobile device. And so, you know, most websites that people are going to these days, I'd imagine are, you know, through mobile rather than a desktop or anything like that.
I was just this communicating in Word and in chat box. I was just putting up an app that I know, the Museum of the Phantom Cities, New York, and how sort of an app can make visible, and it also mobilizes sort of visual and GIS. You know, the ability that we have for these technologies to make visible the social historical forces and the inequalities, no, that remain invisible in our environments. I think it's, as you say, very, very powerful. Scott, I'd like you to hear you talk a little bit more about, because we talk about audiences, it seems to me, in ways that perhaps don't reflect quite as much the impact that all of your projects want to have in such audiences, ways that go beyond sort of communicating and making more, you know, accessible to wider audiences, but there are very sort of explicit critical projects embedded in both your projects. And Scott, in the development of your project, we talked a lot about how these techniques of storytelling, walking and mapping, that you want to mobilize them to generate a different disposition towards environmental justice. So it's not just about, you know, being educational, but about generating some form of social reaction or social activism to issues of environmentalism and environmental injustice. So I think that speaks a little bit what you were saying, writing, not just targeting specific audiences, but making new forms of archival information and archival visualization that bring in those audiences in with certain affect, if you will. And I remember we talked about intimacy when we were talking about podcasts. And I think this is probably not intimacy, sort of the emotion or the affect that we're talking about, but there's some form of affect that you want to generate with these techniques and these projects. I don't know if you have any, this is not so much a question as sort of an idea that I want to float in there. As you think of your projects, you know, I'm thinking, right, what if we had all known a little bit better about the ways in which, you know, the maps and the space informs racial inequality, you know, in times of epidemics, for instance. So that kind of reaction that an image produces in very powerful ways, or a map produces in powerful ways. So as I'm speaking, I'm hoping that others might have some closing comments and closing questions.
And I'll say, in regards to that, I think, you know, having an interdisciplinary team and having people from these different disciplines just increases your ability to communicate to different audiences. And also it makes the project, I think, more critical because you have more eyes on it, more perspective from different areas. It can definitely be a challenge in finding that kind of direction of the project because, you know, each discipline has their own standards and their own everything. But I think that, you know, moving towards that interdisciplinary kind of team-based approach rather than the lone historian in the archive that's going to produce something, it really opens up the possibilities of these projects and the, you know, possible audiences and the creating, you know, a form of affect on the audiences and just having diversity in the way we communicate.
Yeah, I just want to add, you know, because once again, and those of you that are entering the program for next year, you'll love working with Maria. And so once again, you know, so one of my other things I did when I used to be at Columbia was I gave history tours of the city, and I thought, well, you know, this Harlem walking tour will be somewhat similar. I had some great speakers, a photographer of the Harlem River, a coastal flooding expert, and we were all going to sort of do the walk, and that was kind of going to be it. But Maria was like, no, that's not enough. That's no good. You need to actually get people to really sort of engage with it and sort of be a part of the production of knowledge. So originally, and I'm still figuring out how it's going to take place digitally, but after the sort of first part of the walk was completed, we were going to break up into different groups and sort of, you know, create sketches and ideas about, you know, how can we reconnect people with the river and things like that. And it was going to be a more collaborative sort of, almost like being in a seminar discussion rather than sort of, you know, spoon-fed top-down approach. And that just made the walk seem so much more useful, and made, you know, the audience itself was, you know, producing that knowledge too. So.
Yep. Yeah, and I will say, Scott, I have full confidence, and I much look forward to see how you rethink the collective walk digitally, and, you know, how do you design the sort of the walking experience in a critical way, sort of individually, and you are the one, the curator, if you will, of bringing all of that together in a collective conversation for the collective production of knowledge. And I'll say that this digital environmental walk, virtual environmental walk, is currently under design and will happen sometime during the summer, we hope. And we hope that everyone can join. Is that right, Scott?
That's right, yeah.
Yes, but for now, I'm gonna have to close our fantastic conversation today and invite you to join us for a panel next week, same time on Wednesday, same Zoom link, that will feature Alex Mendez, who has a project we have called, for this particular event, Multilingual Youth as Curator, and her guests include James Doe, who's an education curator at the Met, and Carissa Musialik, who's a DOE public school, middle school teacher here in New York. So we're very much looking forward to that conversation and to see you all back here. For now, join me all in thanking Scot and Wright for their presentations, and wish them luck for the future of their projects, and wish you all very good for the incoming week.